Kanban boards, Agile boards, Scrum boards, whatever you call them, we're going deep on them. I'm talking column naming, process columns, buffer columns, swim lanes, blocked items, WIP limits, card aging, everything from the basics to some rather nifty tips and tricks. Welcome back to the shed at the bottom of the garden, where we are for the very first time attempting a fancy two-camera setup. I know what's coming is not a rant about physical boards versus agile boards. Most of what I'm going to be talking about today can be done on both, but I will be highlighting things that can only be done on a physical board and one or two things that can only be done on an electronic board. With that said, what are we looking at here? Well, we're looking at a Kanban board. That's probably the most correct word for it, name for it. Agile board, I think, is probably become quite common. Scrum board as well, often used by Scrum teams. Surprising that. Whatever you call it, I would recommend it for any Agile team, regardless of framework or methodology. 3 columns, not 3 swim lanes, by the way. I'll say more about swim lanes later. 3 columns: to do, doing, and done. This is the only column where work gets done. You could call that an active column. I call it a process column. I'm not even sure that's the right term. If you know of the correct or better term, please let me know in the comments. The board, of course, is for tracking work. The very first board I had any dealings with was one very much like this. It was using a whiteboard with drawn-on columns and index cards to track individual backlog items across the board. Aided and abetted, of course, by a Blog of BluTak. Other brands available. The second board I had dealings with was printed on a big sheet of paper with columns just wide enough for a single post-it. And this is how the board might look for a Scrum team if this was right at the beginning of the sprint. The items here in to do are essentially the sprint backlog. That's of course not the case for Kanban. More on that in a moment. When an item is picked up, it's moved into this column to indicate that it's now being actively worked on. And it's at that point and no earlier that this item should be assigned to a person. As time goes on, items get pulled in from to do, and eventually items make it all the way across to the done column. And by the time, if this is still the Scrum team, by the time we get into the middle of the sprint, the board looks pretty much as it would for a Kanban team. Going back to the to-do column, as I said, Scrum teams have a sprint, they have sprint planning, they have a way of generating work for this column. In Kanban, things are a little different. In Kanban, the work pretty much drives everything, and we can enable that with another line on this board. This in Kanban is called a trigger point. It's very much like a reorder point that supermarkets and such like will use to let them know that they're running short on a particular item and that they should go on and order more stock. And that's exactly how it works on the board. In this position, there are 3 items still left in to do. Well, nothing to do at the moment, but when this item gets picked up and now these 2 items move up above this trigger point, that's the time to call a meeting. And typically it takes a while to get the meeting together, to run the meeting, to the result of which will be more items for the to-do column. And the idea being is that if this is the state when the meeting is called, there's enough work to carry on with if it takes, say, a day or perhaps 2 days to get that meeting organized. So maybe this one gets picked up in the meantime, this one also gets picked up. And then finally, the result of that planning meeting would be some extra work that would hopefully fill up this column again. Trigger point. In these days of continuous integration, it's been a long time since I packaged multiple items into a release. But back in the old days when I used a board like this was a nice little trick to create to use an index card to represent a release and to use it to gather together items that would be part of that release. Making it easy for the person whose job it was to handle the release to pick up this index card, check that everything was okay with all of the items that were part of that release, and package it up and send it on its way. We've got our board and we're able to track work across it, but the board can do a lot more for us than that. And I've cleaned most of the work off the board just to make the point that if we can take items from to do, get them into doing, and get them over to done, if we can do that in the shortest possible time, well, you can't really get any better than this. That's what in Kanban is called single piece flow. And it's kind of what we're always trying to get to. In the real world, though, we often end up in a situation that's very different than that, with a doing column that just gets longer and longer and longer. And it's easy to see how this can happen. We are, after all, doing Agile. We're solving difficult problems. Chances are, from time to time, we're going to get stuck. Items are going to get blocked. And what we tend to do is reach for another card. And that's why the doing column left unchecked can continue to grow and grow. And that's a problem because we end up with a situation where things hang around a long time in the doing column, the very opposite of the single piece flow that I described before. And here's one thing that I can't easily represent on this physical board, but some electronic boards can do, and that is to indicate the age of cards. It was actually the reason I upgraded to a paid Trello subscription, was to have this kind of visual aging where the cards kind of fade away over time. And card age is actually a pretty powerful parameter. We're going to get into work in progress limits in a second, but you can essentially extrapolate all of Kanban from this idea of minimizing the age of all of the work items. Powerful, powerful stuff. Let's move on. Red pen at the ready. Let's go ahead and impose a WIP limit. And because I've got a physical board and my column is just one PostIt wide, I can do this rather nifty trick, putting a horizontal line to indicate that work in progress limit, WIP limit for short. 4 cards being the maximum that is allowed. For an electronic board, it's more typical that the number is written at the top of the column somewhere. And a breach of that WIP limit, it's quite hard to say, is typically indicated by turning the entire column red. Now, if you're using an electronic board, but it doesn't support work in progress limits, I have a little bit of a hack for you. Let's say, just to fit on my board, that this is the work in progress limit, just 3 items. A way of indicating that work in progress limit, and remember I did say this was kind of hacky, is to create a dummy card, ideally change its color, and it gets positioned at the bottom of the list here. The idea being that if another card is picked up, it ends up here and it's visually obvious that the WIP limit has been breached. Now, the problem, of course, is when this card is moved, then these all ripple up. And it's a manual operation then to reposition this one in the 4th position in this column. As for coming up with a number for that work in progress limit, my rule of thumb is to take the number of people doing the doing and multiply it by somewhere between 1.5 and 2. Maybe start at twice the number of people and over time attempt to reduce that number down. Remember the board I mentioned earlier, the one printed on a big sheet of paper? Well, the first thing I noticed about it was that it was made of paper. The second thing I noticed about it is that it had many, many columns, many more than the 3 columns you see here before you. So yeah, let's talk about adding more columns into the mix. So I've redrawn the board. It starts with to do, ends with done, but in place of doing, I now have 3 active, 3 process columns. We'll talk about what they are in just a moment. But the big question is, do we need extra columns? And how do we know if we need 1, 2, or 3? And the way to determine that is to figure out if and how often work changes hands. So if work goes from to do and is picked up by this guy, and this guy takes it all the way to done, then 1 column is enough. If that's how all of the team operate, everyone picks up their own ticket and sticks with it all the way to the end, 1 column is enough. The board that we were just looking at before, the doing column in the middle, perfect. However, oops, that person shouldn't have been. I early assigned someone there. Shouldn't be assigned at this point. If, however, this person picks up the ticket, assigns himself or herself to it, and then passes on to someone else, then it looks like we need 2 columns. And I'm sure you can see where this is going. If this person then passes on to another person, then 3 columns is the right number. So let's fill in a possible set of 3 processes for this particular team. I hope I'm not going to upset anyone by having test as a separate process. I know there's a little bit of a problem with that in Agile. I'm using it as an example, possibly because it's actually quite common to find teams with a test function. If you have concerns about that, I hope I will allay some of them in a second. I'm going to say that this process is dev and the first one is design. 3 processes, 3 columns. I'm going to move this one back here and put these guys at the top of their processes. Actually, let's give dev a helping hand. 3 quick points before we move on. First of all, what I've drawn here is a little bit unfair. We'll be fixing the fairness factor in just a moment. Secondly, I hope you got the message when I talked about handing work, passing work. It's almost like passing the baton from one person to another across the board. That, I hope you can see, is very team specific. In a company with multiple teams, it's unlikely they're going to be having the same structure of work or workflow across all of their teams. And yet what I see too often is companies that have standardized their Agile boards, again, probably using Jira or similar, giving everyone the same structure, even though it probably doesn't match the team. So keep it team, my advice here would be to keep it team specific. 2 teams sitting right beside one another. One might have 3 columns here. One might be happy with just a single column. Should be team specific. Final thing to say, and then we'll move on. When naming these columns, I've tried all kinds of naming strategies. The one that works the best is to use the imperative voice. The imperative, because I do sound like something of a grammar nerd here, and I kind of am. The imperative is the thing that you use when you're giving instructions, like jump, run, stop, go, that kind of word. So design, it's like a command. Develop, it's like a command. Test, like a command. Works well in pretty much every situation I've come across, and tends to be shorter, terser, easier to write on a board like this than options such as designing, developing, testing, or even something like in progress. Design, dev, test, keep it imperative. We have a board now that accurately reflects the way this team works. It reflects its workflow, design into dev, into test. Now, concern you may be having, and it's certainly one that a colleague of mine had back in the day, the first time we went for a multi-column board like this, and his concern was, doesn't this drive a wedge between the individual functions, between dev and test, between design and dev. And yeah, I mean, that kind of makes sense, but I hope I'm going to show you that actually the opposite may be true, that it might help the various parts of the team to work more closely together. We'll get to that in a moment. What is a valid concern is to do with work in progress. I hope you can see that even if we restricted every column to just one item, there'd still be three times as much work potentially in progress than we had in our single column setup. So yes, we have paid a price in terms of work in progress when moving from a single process column to three process columns, and we do it willingly because of some of the benefits that accrue, as I hope, again, you will soon see. And the first of those benefits come when we add back those work in progress limits. I'm going to go for here, here, and here. Reflect them at the top for the electronic version. Let's go for 2 here, 4 here, and 2 here. Now, an experienced team might be able to operate here with a minimum of work in progress. But any real-world team that I've ever dealt with, or certainly that I've been a part of, will sooner or later get to a point where everything is at its work in progress limits. Question for you. Looking at this board and the work in progress limits, which of these cards can move? Well, it's only these 2 here. Dev is stuck. It can neither move items into test nor pick up new work from design. Similarly, design can't move into dev, nor can it pick up more work from to do. So what's a poor developer to do? Well, one thing they could do is nothing. That's certainly better than magically introducing more work in progress into the system. But what they really should do is walk over to test and ask if they can help out. That's the positive thing to do. And that's the response to, aren't we driving a wedge? No, we're not. Those work in progress limits have actually led to dev moving across to ask test if they can help out. If anything, this board and those work in progress limits have drawn different members of the team together. Powerful, powerful stuff. And just to see the things really do unblock, once an item moves here, then this one can move. All of these move up. We can pull in another item here if we're ready, and design also unblocked. We can pull things in. A quick word about card value. In terms of value delivered to the customer, none of these cards have delivered any. None of them will until they make it to the done column and they get released. That's when value is delivered. Having said that, I think it's true to say that this card, all other things being equal, is potentially more important than all of the other cards here, only because it's likely to be the first that gets into done and then gets to deliver its value. So as things go across the board, it could be argued that things get more valuable. And that's one reason that in daily stand-up, provided we're using the walk the wall process, otherwise known as walk the board, that's the reason why we start at the top. It's one of the reasons why we start at the top right of the board, in order to make sure that we talk about the most important items first. So we start at here, move down this column, over to dev, go all the way down this column into design. If we run out of time, if we exceed that time boxed 15 minutes and we don't get to these tickets, it's not the end of the world. We covered the most important ones. There's also a really practical reason that we start at the top right. If I, again, load this board up, put everything at its work in progress limit, as we saw before, these are the only cards that can move. If we start at the top during our daily stand-up and we find this one can move, well, we've opened things up If I'd started to move cards starting here, things would have got messy very, very quickly. Did I mention blocked items? Let's talk about them now. Several ways that we can indicate blocked items on a board. The first way that I see a lot, which doesn't make me happy, I don't think it's a very good method, but I can see why it's simple and it kind of works, and that is to create a dedicated column for blocked items, either just before done or just after to do. Yeah, it kind of works, but there are better ways. On a physical board, and I wish I'd known this back in the day when I used a physical board, this is something that someone told me about much more recently, is that if this card gets blocked, pick it up, put it down like that. We now have a strong indication that this card is different. So that's another way of doing it. The electronic version of doing that is to tag the card in some way, and I guess ideally, oops, reaching for another post-it. This is the blocked item. It gets tagged. Ideally, it changes color, and again, visual indication on the electronic board that this one is blocked. One other way of doing this, which is the first way that I used, I don't like it as much as this. I'll say that straight away. Have a row that was specifically for blocked items. If this was the item that was blocked, got moved into this row to indicate that it's blocked. Now there's a subtle but important difference between this approach, moving it down here, versus turning on it on its edge or tagging it with a tag. And that is what it strongly applies about work in progress. If I leave it here, if I move it on a diagonal or tag it, it's still taking up work in progress. It's still not possible for dev to pull in some new work. It's part of that. Oh, I think we said it was 4, but yeah, it looks smaller than that just at the moment. So I don't have a big enough board here. I'm really sorry about that. However, if we move it into this dedicated row for blocked, it looks, well, it's more than strongly suggested, isn't it? The dev now just has 2 items in progress. We've not only moved it into this row, but we've removed it from the work in progress for that process column. And my question to you is, which is correct, or at least which is more correct? Let me know in those comments. Right back at the beginning, which is quite a long time ago now, I mentioned swim lanes. I would argue that there are no swim lanes here in the same way, I think, as in a swimming pool, which I think is where the term comes from. Before they put any ropes in, I don't think we talk about there being just one swim lane. It's like they put the rope in and now there's 1 or 2 swim lanes, depending on how you look at it. Anyway, let's add a swim lane to this board. I'm going to start by squishing everything up and kind of creating some space for it. So here is our swim lane. Probably doesn't need to run across done. What that gives us is effectively another route across the board, from to do, into design, through to dev, test, and done. And there is a number of reasons that you might want to do this, and several reasons why you wouldn't. I've used it in the past when the team was trying to add more unit tests to the code base, and we decided to track that separately from other work on the board. The most common use for this is as a kind of an express route across the board for super urgent items. I think this is sometimes called a silver bullet swim lane. Is that good for items in the silver bullet swim lane? Yes, it is. Is it good for the work on this board as a whole? No, it isn't. This could take us into a discussion about queuing theory, and I don't really know enough about that. But yeah, the message here is use them sparingly, if at all. When I added the extra columns, I said there's a little bit of unfairness hiding here. Indeed there is, and it's time for me to address it. If I look at design, design can pull items in from to do. That is good. But what about when design finishes work? What does it do with it? Well, the only move available to it is for it to push its work into dev. Now, If you know anything about Kanban, you know it's all about the pull and not the push. This is really, I've always thought this was really unfair, that all of a sudden Dev's got another item, another item that's contributing to its work in progress that it never asked for. That's the unfairness. We need to set things up that so that Dev has the same rights and privileges as design. Design is able to pull, Dev should also be able to pull. I guess a hack on a physical board like this would be maybe to put the card halfway across the two columns. Of course, for an electronic board, that's not going to work. So let's do this properly. I'm going to have to add in a few more columns. I've got a board to clean. So I've introduced two new columns, which I hope are going to sort out the fairness issue. Both of the columns I added are buffer columns. Let's just indicate that with a B. A buffer column is a column where no work gets done. This is where work sits waiting to be picked up by the next stage. So let's see if we really have solved the fairness problem. So item in to do, design can pull from that column. That's fine. That was always fine. When design is finished, it can move it into this buffer column. That's a change of state. That's not a push. Dev now has been given the right, the privilege that design always has to pull work in when Dev is ready for it. So that's a pull. It happens when Dev wants it and not a moment before. And again, Dev, when this item is complete, it moves it into this buffer column where it waits until test is ready to pull it in its turn. And again, test now has the same privileges as design and now Dev to be able to pull when it is ready. The mantra being, as this sticker says, we want to be pulling, not pushing. Final step, test doesn't need its own buffer column because the done column that we've had right from the beginning serves the same purpose. When it comes to WIP limits, I guess I can add back the WIP limits that we had before, if I can remember them. I think we had 2 there, 4 there, and 2 here. And I guess we could do the same for these new buffer columns. I might add a 1 here and maybe 2 here. But we can do better than that by using something called shared WIP, shared work in progress. But to do that, we need to figure out who owns these new columns, who owns these buffer columns. So is this column owned by design or is it owned by dev? And the answer to that kind of comes down to, well, it's a question of control. When design has pulled in, as we said, and that's fair and proper, and when design is finished, it needs a place to put it, and it moves it over here. All of those actions were in design's control. Everything that we did here, pulling it in and moving across to buffer, is in design's control, and it therefore owns both of those columns. If dev owned this column, well, design would have been messing with it, and that's not what we want. That wouldn't be fair. So the way the columns split up, by the way, you always end up with an odd number when you set up a thing like this, is that there's a to-do column, and then it goes pair, develop owns this buffer column, and test, and I guess in a way, done is a buffer column, and it is owned by test. Now establish a work in progress limit that is shared across these two. I believe it was 2 before when we only had design, so let's make it 3. And here's where that flexibility comes in. We could have 3 items here, or 2 and 1, 1 and 2, or all 3 in that buffer column. Let's do a similar thing over here. Dev was 4 before, so maybe 5 or even 6 would work there. And for the sake of completeness, 6 items here, 5 and 1, 4 and 2, 3 and 3, 2 and 4, 1 and 5, or all 6 in that buffer column. Test we haven't really changed, so we just leave that unaltered. Establishing the ownership also helps us name these columns. The longhand would be design and design done, dev and dev done. One final wrinkle, there's kind of a conventional way of laying this out, which removes repetition, adds clarity, and emphasizes the pairing of columns. And that's it. Everything I know, and probably a few things I shouldn't, about Agile boards. Did I miss anything out? Did I get anything wrong? Do you have any top tips? Share them, please do. You know where. Them their comments below.